In December 1989, the world watched as one of the most tightly controlled communist regimes in Eastern Europe collapsed almost overnight. At the center was a husband and wife duo who had ruled Romania for decades with fear, propaganda, and absolute control. Nicolae Ceaușescu and his wife Elena had built a personality cult so strong that many Romanians were afraid to even speak their names. But everything changed in days. And in the end, Elena faced a firing squad after one of the fastest trials of the 20th century. Elena Petrescu was born on January 7, 1916, in the village of Petresti, located in Dâmbovița County in southern Romania. Her family was poor and worked the land. She had limited access to education, completing only a few years of primary school. Early on, she was known to struggle academically and was described as having difficulty reading and writing fluently. As a teenager, Elena moved to Bucharest in search of work. She found employment at a textile factory and later worked as a laboratory assistant at the Bucharest Institute of Chemistry. It was during these years that she became involved in communist political activities. Romania was still under monarchy at the time, and the Communist Party operated illegally. In 1939, she officially joined the Romanian Communist Party. That same year, she met Nicolae Ceaușescu, who was 5 years younger than her and already deeply involved in underground party work. Nicolae had been arrested several times for his communist activities and was considered a loyal and committed member. Elena and Nicolae formed a close relationship, bonding over their shared political beliefs. After World War II, the Soviet Union took control of Romania's political future. In 1947, King Michael was forced to abdicate, and Romania was declared a People's Republic. The Romanian Communist Party took full control of the state, supported by Soviet authorities. Nicolae Ceaușescu began to climb the ranks under the leadership of Gheorghe Gheorghu Dej. Elena, though not holding high office, remained in influential circles. She worked in party bureaucracies and gradually became a trusted insider, known for her loyalty and protectiveness of Nicolae. When Gheorghu Dej died in 1965, Nicolae became the new General Secretary of the Communist Party. Under his leadership, Romania started to distance itself from direct Soviet control. Elena's visibility began to grow, though she still had no formal academic background. She was appointed to the Romanian Academy in 1965 and began receiving state honors and degrees without completing any advanced studies. In 1971, after a visit to China and North Korea, Nicolae Ceaușescu launched the July Thesis, a cultural revolution that emphasized strict ideological control, increased censorship, and the elevation of national leaders. This marked the beginning of the Ceaușescu's personality cult. Elena's image started appearing more prominently in public life. She was promoted as a national role model, especially for women and the youth. Her public image was carefully crafted and aggressively promoted by the Romanian state. She was officially presented as a brilliant scientist, mother of the nation, and a leading figure in international politics and academia. Her official title became Dr. Engineer Elena Ceaușescu, and she was often introduced at public events with long, exaggerated lists of honors and awards. Despite her limited education and no proven contributions to scientific research, she was made head of the National Council for Science and Technology in 1974. That position gave her direct control over Romania's scientific institutions, research grants, and academic appointments. Romanian chemists and researchers were routinely forced to cite her in their work, credit her in discoveries she had no part in, and attend events where her achievements were praised. She was granted honorary degrees from multiple universities across Romania and even received recognition for some foreign institutions, usually arranged through diplomatic channels or political pressure. State media produced documentaries, articles, and books that glorified her career and intelligence. These materials were printed and broadcast across the country in large volumes. Elena's image was placed beside Nicolae's on banners, posters, currency, and in government buildings. Children in schools were meant to memorize facts about her scientific accomplishments. and women's organizations were directed to present her as a role model for Romanian women. She was awarded the Hero of Socialist Labor title and named a full member of the Romanian Academy, one of the country's highest academic bodies. Internally, Elena played a growing role in managing party affairs. She sat in the Politburo, the highest decision-making body of the Communist Party, and influenced state planning, personnel changes, and ideological enforcement. Officials who displeased her were often removed from office or sidelined. Her temper was feared by many in the inner circle, and her approval became necessary for anyone seeking a high-level promotion. The Ceaușescus lived in several palaces, including the Spring Palace in Bucharest, and had access to imported luxury items during a time when basic goods like meat, sugar, and gas were rationed. Special food supplies, medical care, and security arrangements were reserved for them and a few close allies. Their travels abroad included grand receptions, costly gifts, and entourages of dozens of aides and bodyguards. By 1981, Romania's foreign debt had reached nearly $11 billion, a massive burden for a country with a struggling economy. To address it, Nicolae Ceaușescu implemented a strict austerity program, with Elena fully supporting the decisions. The goal was to repay all foreign debts as quickly as possible, regardless of the social cost. The government slashed imports on food, fuel, and medicine. Industrial production was prioritized over basic human needs. Elena was closely involved in managing scientific and industrial targets, often interfering in technical matters she didn't fully understand. Her orders were considered final, even when they made little practical sense. As a result, productivity fell, but propaganda insisted the country was advancing. By 1982, electricity and gas usage were being tightly rationed. Power outages became a daily routine. Hot water was often available only once a week in many urban areas. In winter, temperatures inside homes dropped below freezing, as central heating was reduced or cut off entirely. Hospitals lacked equipment, rural clinics were understaffed, and many medications disappeared from pharmacies. Food shortages became severe. The government introduced strict rationing, limiting quantities of bread, meat, and milk. People lined up for hours, sometimes starting before dawn, only to find shelves empty. In cities like Bucharest, citizens were forced to use electric cookers due to gas restrictions, further straining the already limited electrical supply. Elena pushed for self-sufficiency in everything, including agriculture and pharmaceuticals. But the policies failed to meet demand. She controlled the National Council for Science and Technology and used it to force unrealistic quotas and production targets. Scientists and factory managers who failed to meet these goals risked demotion, public shaming, or worse. Meanwhile, the Ceaușescus enjoyed uninterrupted power and comfort. They continued to travel on official state visits to countries like China, Iran, and North Korea, where they were received with fanfare. These trips were funded with public money, while Romanian citizens struggled to survive. At home, the Securitate grew stronger. With over 11,000 officers and nearly 500,000 informants by the mid-1980s, it was one of the most repressive secret police systems in the Eastern Bloc. People were monitored in their workplaces, neighborhoods, and even homes. Those caught expressing dissatisfaction, even in private conversations, were interrogated, threatened, or imprisoned. Although foreign journalists were rarely allowed unrestricted access, some reports leaked out. Western radio stations like Radio Free Europe broadcast stories of Romanian suffering, which some locals secretly listened to at great risk. International human rights organizations began highlighting the deteriorating conditions, but the regime dismissed all criticism as lies from the West. By 1986, Elena had cemented her role as one of the top leaders in Romania. She was re-elected to the Political Executive Committee and placed in charge of multiple national commissions, including those overseeing scientific research and higher education. She frequently attended top-level government meetings and often overruled ministers. Her authority extended into sectors she had no expertise in, yet her decisions carried full weight across the country. As Romania became more isolated from both Western powers and its Eastern Bloc neighbors, Elena continued to double down on internal control. She tightened her influence over school curricula, forcing ideological content into every subject, including science and math. Students had to study her life alongside Nicolae's and recite passages about their contributions to socialism during exams and public events. Within the Romanian Academy and other cultural institutions, criticism of Elena's leadership was considered not only risky, but nearly impossible. Officials who failed to show sufficient loyalty were removed or reassigned. Dissenters in academia, publishing, and broadcasting were either silenced or replaced with loyalists. Even Romanian artists and playwrights faced censorship if their work didn't align with the image of the regime. She ordered the creation of more biographies, research papers, and speeches about her achievements. These documents were often ghost-written by teams of state-approved writers. Whole publishing houses were tasked with printing books under her name, many of which were translated into multiple languages to boost her global image. These titles were then gifted during diplomatic visits or showcased in international conferences as part of propaganda efforts. At the same time, the leadership ignored the major changes happening elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc. In 1988, Hungary opened discussions on political reform. In Poland, the Solidarity movement gained more ground. East Germany saw increasing pressure to change. Even the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev had introduced glasnost and perestroika, pushing for openness and reform. But in Romania, there was no such shift. Elena and Nicolae viewed these changes as threats. They insisted that Romania must remain independent and continue following their path. Television and newspapers were filled with speeches attacking foreign ideas and warning against subversive influences. Romanian citizens had limited access to outside news and were constantly fed state-approved narratives that portrayed the Ceausescus as guardians of the nation's stability. Despite all of this, the mood among the public continued to darken. Daily life was still defined by scarcity, surveillance, and fear. Internal reports submitted to the leadership showed rising discontent, but Elena refused to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. She considered any criticism a form of betrayal and demanded loyalty from every level of government and society. The country was growing more isolated diplomatically. The economy was worsening, and even loyal party members were beginning to feel the strain. Yet Elena remained convinced that their control was unshakable. She continued attending public events, surrounded by military officials and party elites, believing the system they built could never collapse. But away from the staged ceremonies and heavily edited news footage, more and more people were reaching their limit. Something had to give, and soon it would. On December 15, 1989, the protest in Timișoara began when the government attempted to evict Laszlo Tokes, a Hungarian Reformed pastor known for criticizing the regime. His congregation gathered to block the eviction. Locals joined in, not just to protect him, but to voice their frustration for the regime's policies. The crowd grew rapidly over the next 2 days. What started as a local demonstration quickly turned into a citywide revolt. On December 17th, the military and Securitate opened fire on unarmed civilians. Over 60 people were killed in Timișoara that day alone, with many more wounded or arrested. Bodies were secretly transported and buried in mass graves to hide the evidence. But despite efforts to contain the news, word spread. Some eyewitnesses managed to get messages out through foreign radio stations. The truth could no longer be hidden. By December 18th, protests resumed even stronger. Factories began to shut down as workers joined in. Students led marches. Security forces cracked down again. But instead of fear, they were met with louder resistance. By December 20th, Timișoara declared itself the first free city of Romania. That same day, high-ranking army officers in the area began refusing orders to shoot civilians. On December 21st, Nicolae, having just returned from a visit to Iran, organized a mass rally in Bucharest. It was meant to display unity and strength, broadcast live to the entire country. Around 80,000 people were gathered in the city's central square, brought in by buses and state organizations. But just minutes into Nicolae's speech, parts of the crowd began to boo. Some people shouted slogans and waved anti-government banners. For the first time in his rule, Nicolae appeared visibly shaken on live TV. Elena tried to calm him, but the damage was done. The broadcast was quickly cut, and confusion broke out. The crowd began pushing toward the stage, and clashes erupted with security forces. That night, protests spread across Bucharest. Demonstrators lit fires, chanted anti-regime slogans, and clashed with riot police. Buildings were damaged, and gunfire was heard throughout the capital. Workers from nearby factories joined the unrest, and the situation spiraled out of the government's control. By the morning of December 22nd, Defense Minister Vasile Mila was reported dead under suspicious circumstances. Officially, it was declared a suicide, but many believed he had been executed for refusing to follow Nicolae's orders to use lethal force against civilians. His death led to a massive shift. Army units across Romania began to abandon the Ceaușescus. Some openly joined the protesters, while others refused to act at all. By noon on December 22nd, the national TV station was taken over by revolutionaries. A new temporary government began to form, calling itself the National Salvation Front. As gunfire echoed across Bucharest, the Ceaușescus fled the presidential headquarters in a helicopter. They were accompanied by a few loyal aides and security officers. However, airspace was being monitored, and their flight path was reported. The pilot, fearing they would be shot down, landed near Titu, a town west of Bucharest. The couple attempted to hide, but were quickly located and arrested by local police and military officers. They were then transported under heavy guard to a military unit in the city of Târgoviște, about 80 kilometers northwest of Bucharest. The army unit, part of the Interior Ministry forces, had not yet taken a clear side in the revolution, but its commander agreed to hold the couple in custody until orders were clarified. Once inside the base, the Ceaușescus were stripped of their formal status and treated as detainees. Their personal bodyguards were disarmed and separated. The couple was placed in a small, sparsely furnished room with metal-framed beds and plain military blankets. The windows were barred, and guards were stationed outside around the clock. For the first time in decades, Nicolae and Elena had no access to aides, advisors, or personal staff. Elena was especially agitated. Soldiers reported that she spoke constantly, demanding to speak to loyal comrades and accusing high-ranking officers of treason. She refused to believe that the Central Committee had abandoned them and insisted the uprising was a foreign plot. Nicolae appeared quieter and withdrawn, but also showed disbelief that their regime had truly fallen. He asked for a typewriter and a notepad, hoping to draft a declaration or communicate with what he assumed were still supportive party members. His request was denied. They were fed standard army rations, boiled potatoes, bread, and water, and were not permitted to bathe or change clothes. Both wore the same outfits they had fled Bucharest in. Nicolae was in a simple wool coat, and Elena in a heavy overcoat and scarf. They slept on narrow cots under harsh lighting, with guards inspecting them frequently. Medical personnel checked them once daily, confirming they were in stable condition. Outside the base, Romania was in chaos. Sporadic gunfire continued in several cities. There were rumors of possible counterattacks by forces loyal to the old regime, particularly by units of the Securitate who had not yet surrendered. The newly formed National Salvation Front, led by Ion Iliescu and other former communists who had broken away from the Ceaușescus, faced enormous pressure from protesters and military commanders alike. People demanded immediate justice. There were growing fears that keeping the couple alive for too long could spark more bloodshed. Reports circulated that armed groups might try to rescue them, or that their mere survival could fuel rumors of a political comeback. The army leadership at the Târgoviște garrison also became uneasy, as confusion continued about who was officially in charge and whether the Ceaușescus would be transferred or executed. By the evening of December 24th, after hours of closed-door talks in Bucharest, the new leadership reached a decision that Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu would be put on trial the next day by a military tribunal. The process would be swift. There would be no appeal. On the morning of December 25, 1989, the Ceaușescus were brought under guard to a makeshift courtroom inside the Târgoviște Army base. The trial was organized under extreme pressure and secrecy, with only a handful of military officials, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and officers present. The process was overseen by a special military tribunal formed by the National Salvation Front, led by General Gica Popa and prosecutor Dan Voina. The trial began at approximately 1:20 p.m. and was held in a small room inside the base. There was no jury, and the couple had no prior access to legal counsel. Their assigned lawyer, Nicolae Ceaușescu, had only minutes to speak with them before the session started. The proceedings were videotaped using a single camera, mainly for documentation and later public release. The charges against Nicolae and Elena included 5 main counts: genocide, armed attack on the people, undermining the national economy, destruction of public property, and attempting to flee the country using state funds. The accusation of genocide was based on the number of deaths during the protests, estimated by the court to be over 60,000, though post-revolution investigations placed the figure closer to 1,100. The charge also included decades of oppressive rule that caused long-term suffering. Throughout the trial, Elena was combative. She repeatedly interrupted the prosecutor, shouted at the officers, and rejected the authority of the court. She refused to answer many of the questions and called the trial a farce. Nicolae, while slightly more composed, insisted that they were still the legitimate heads of state and demanded to speak with the National Assembly. He claimed the revolution was a coup orchestrated by traitors and foreign agents. The judges, already under instructions to move quickly, limited the couple's statements and pressed forward. The trial lacked most standard legal procedures. No evidence was formally presented, no witnesses were called, and the defense had no opportunity to cross-examine. The atmosphere was tense and the guards remained on alert, aware of the chaos still unfolding across the country. Just before 2:45 p.m., the court declared its verdict that both Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death by firing squad. The ruling included immediate execution, with no appeal or postponement. The decision was signed and announced within minutes. Though rushed and controversial, the trial was seen by the new leadership as a necessary act to restore order and prevent further violence. With gunfire still echoing in parts of Romania and rumors of possible loyalist retaliation, the authorities believed that delaying the sentence could have dangerous consequences. The soldiers standing outside the courtroom were given their final orders. The execution would take place immediately within the walls of the same military compound. Nicolae and Elena were immediately escorted from the makeshift courtroom to a small courtyard within the Târgoviște military base. It was a cold winter afternoon with snow covering the ground. The execution team had already been selected from a group of elite paratroopers led by Captain Ionel Boeru. He and 2 other soldiers were assigned to carry out the sentence. The Ceaușescus were brought outside under heavy guard. They were not given time for final statements or last requests. As they were taken into the yard, Elena continued shouting angrily at the soldiers and officers. She demanded that they not be separated and insisted that they be executed together. Her disbelief never wavered. She still claimed the court had no right to do this, and that she and her husband were Romania's rightful rulers. Nicolae tried to remain composed, but he appeared pale and weak. His hands were trembling as he was tied with ropes. Elena, too, had her hands bound. The 2 were placed side by side against a plain wall in the corner of the courtyard. This wall was chosen for its privacy and solid surface. There was no ceremonial structure or official stage. The execution order was given quickly. The soldiers raised their rifles and fired a long volley. Dozens of bullets struck the couple. According to reports, they were both killed almost instantly, though medical confirmation came seconds later. The entire execution, from the moment they entered the yard to the final shots, lasted less than 5 minutes. The shooting was captured on a single video camera operated by army personnel. The footage was intended to serve as proof, both for the Romanian people and for the outside world, that the Ceaușescu regime had truly ended. Just a few days later, parts of the execution video were shown on national television. For many Romanians, it was the first time they saw with their own eyes that the dictatorship was over. Their bodies were placed in plain wooden coffins and flown by helicopter to Bucharest, and buried in a military cemetery called Ghencea. At first, the graves were unmarked to prevent any pilgrimages by loyalists. Later, small headstones were added. Their execution marked the end of communist rule in Romania. The country began to move toward democracy, but the legacy of the Ceaușescus left deep wounds. Elena, in particular, became a symbol of the arrogance and cruelty of the regime. Her rapid rise to power, despite her lack of education and her heavy-handed rule, left a bitter memory among Romanians. Over the years, conspiracy theories and debates about the trial and execution have continued. Some argue that the process was rushed. Others say it was the only way to prevent further chaos. But most Romanians agreed on one thing: that their era of fear had finally ended. Elena's name remains controversial in Romania. Many institutions that once carried her name were renamed, and academic papers were exposed as frauds, and her awards were removed posthumously. In the 2000s, the Ceausescu's graves became the focus of public attention again. In 2010, their remains were exhumed at the request of their family to confirm their identity through DNA testing. The results confirmed that the bodies buried at Ghencea were indeed Nicolae and Elena.